This begins our lesson series on the Psalms, and we'll cover this by what's called books. The Psalms are divided up into about 5 books, chapters, Psalms, not chapters, 1 to 41, 42 to 47, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, and 107 to 150. And they were written by at least 8 different people over many generations, and they're basically a worship hymnal, a songbook is what the Psalms are. And though they cover all sorts of emotions and situations, they also contain prophecy as the New Testament interprets it. And Jesus was one of those people who cited the Old Testament and some of the Psalms as prophetic. So mostly the prophecies in the Psalms are about the Messiah and his coming kingdom. And of course, you might want to see the commentary I have some of on the screen here on the right. This is Constable's commentary. For the most part, it's a good one. It has lots of detail, more than most people would care to see, but it has its moments also where it kind of drops the ball on women's issues. But we won't be running into that much in the Old Testament here, at least. So on the left, we have the Net Bible, New English Translation. The Septuagint really doesn't change a lot as far as I can tell on the Psalms, so I may do some spot checking here and there, but I'll be showing the New English Translation on the left and the Constable commentary on the right. And I don't know if I'm going to bother changing the proportions or anything, but anyway, we have book 1, the first 41 chapters is what we'll cover today, and the Psalms, since they are poetic hymns, make use of a literary device known as parallelism, as opposed to the English convention of rhyming. So when you have poetry in the Hebrew way of thinking, you're not going to have rhymes. You will have pairs of lines that either express the same thought 2 ways, or a positive and negative of the thought, and sometimes one thought expressed then again in a more intense way. So we have to be careful not to misinterpret them because of that parallelism, that they're always talking about 2 different things. They're not. So the Psalms of the first book are mostly those of David and his experiences with God. There are a few Davidic Psalms elsewhere, but for the most part, most scholars believe that all of this first book are his. Psalm 1 contrasts the way of the righteous with the way of the wicked, which is the character of all the Psalms in general. And it teaches and encourages holy living in practical terms, mainly that bad company corrupts good character, and you'll find that phrase in the New Testament. So as opposed to the practice of emptying the mind as meditation is in other religions, righteous meditation fills the mind with the instructions of God, which is what is meant by the law or Torah. And of course, for the writers, it included obeying the law of Moses as well, because that's what they were under at the time. And such a practice in daily life will be expressed in the way we live. That's the essence of that psalm. And we're not going to go line by line over the psalms. These are hymns after all, and we don't want to hyperanalyze, although the commentary somewhat does that. But the point being that these are things that people will want to read for themselves. Now, verse 7 in Psalm 1 is, I think I've got something mixed up here on my markings on my notes, but it says that the Messiah is one of the persons of the Godhead, the Trinity, who also became human at an appointed time. And I think I had skipped down the reason because there's no verse 7 there. I was like, oh, I skipped to verse Psalm 2, sorry. And Psalm 2 shows the folly of trying to win against God, who is no more threatened by people or angels than a boot is threatened by an ant. It's widely held to be messianic, which refutes the claim of critics that the Old Testament God is wicked and violent, while Jesus is holy and passive, because Jesus as Messiah will return not as a helpless infant, but as the Lion of Judah and the mighty God, as also stated in Isaiah 9:6. And also in Colossians 1:16, it says that Jesus himself is the creator. So it's possible, impossible to separate the God of the Old Testament from that of the New Testament. And then this is where we see in verse 7 that this Messiah is one of the persons of the Trinity who also became human at a point in time called today. This is the Son of God, and no son can be as old as his father. So the Son will rule with an iron hand, as shown in verse 9. So again, we can't separate the God of the Old Testament with Jesus. And then we go on to Psalm 3, which is a lament over the success of the wicked and God's apparent inaction, but it's coupled with confidence in God's eventual action. So he will make it right, even though at the present he seems to not be there. Some commentators see Psalms 3 through 7 as describing the eventual sufferings of Israel in the tribulation, but of course they can also apply to persecution of the righteous at any time. The word deliverance or salvation in most cases in the Old Testament refers to this life rather than eternity. Though David had multiplied enemies, he was confident that God would rescue and vindicate him in this life. Even today, those who see our many enemies, either personally or collectively, claim it as proof that we're the guilty ones, but because they all agree with each other. That's why they think that. Likewise, for the Jews as a people, critics say that they must all be evil since many nations have driven them out. And that is just fallacious thinking. Psalm 4, it adds to the previous psalm that the wicked should think twice before opposing those who call on God for help. And then Psalm 5 is continuing on that theme and adds that the wicked are liars with vain, shallow hearts. David implores God that these people would be caught in their own traps and schemes. Then Psalm 6 is more of a personal lament and a plea for God's discipline to come not in anger or wrath. We should never think that God disciplines us for any other reason than love and training. As for the question about Hades, or hell in some translations, David's point is that the living need to hear the praises of God, which would be lost if the righteous were all in the grave. So he appeals to God to preserve him in this life so he can be a witness to others. And then Psalm 7 deals with being pursued by false accusers. As a righteous judge, God must both acquit the innocent and condemn the guilty. It's not loving or kind to deny victims the honor of being vindicated, nor to punish them twice by letting their attackers suffer no consequences for their slander. So we have to really understand that point, that it is not loving for God to allow sin to go unpunished. And so why would we think when we try to practice our Christianity that somehow we're being godly if we don't punish people who haven't asked for forgiveness? Because if you grant forgiveness without also requiring repentance, you will enable and encourage sin. Now, Psalm 8, I skipped on my notes again, I got to stop doing that, is a more general praise of God as creator whose existence is obvious even to children. But what exactly does it mean that God made people, quote, a little lower than the angels? The word there in Hebrew is Elohim for God, but in Greek, the word is angelos, angel. The context is all about God and the wonder of how we mortals have been placed in charge of everything else he made. So in my opinion, the meaning of angels seems out of place here, and it should read God, even though the Septuagint reads angel there. And then in Psalm 9, that praises God for what he has done, which we often forget to do. It also speaks of those who know God's name and put their hope in him, which along with endurance and righteous acts was what saved a person before Jesus rose from the dead. The vast majority of Old Testament statements about salvation refer to peace and prosperity in this life, with only the most general references to eternity. And in Psalm 10, David is pleading for God to put a stop to the success of the wicked when he seems far away. Though we should know, as in the previous psalm, that God can be trusted to avenge and rescue us in his time, there's nothing wrong with pleading for that, as long as it's pleading and not scolding. There's a lot of what I see in a lot of Christians doing prayer in a way that practically demands that God do something for them. And I find that rather arrogant. I think it is more of almost a superstition, a superstitious way of, and let me hide this image, sorry for right now, didn't mean that to pop up at this time, but it seems superstitious and demanding to think that because we say certain things or do certain things, then God is obligated to us in some way. And I think this is really dangerous ground to be on. So now let's go to Psalm 11. And it seems to have been written during a time when David was being pursued by enemies, but he's confident that even if all other allies were to fall, God will bring rescue and justice in time. And then Psalm 12 is another expression of despair at the times when God seems distant. But again, David also expresses his confidence that God will come to his aid. Though he was chosen by God to be king, the path to his destiny was anything but smooth. So we shouldn't give up on God. It's a test of our faith and loyalty, not the plan of God to make his enemies overconfident. Or I should say, nor the plan. I mean, this is what God often does. He will make them overconfident by letting himself seem distant so that our prayers are not answered and our enemies gloat, and that sets them up to be overconfident. So now let's go to Psalm 13, and it continues the theme of despair and desperation and shows us that there is nothing wrong with honestly admitting this to God. David, like many of the patriarchs before him, appeals to God to defend his own honor, God's own honor, by delivering his people, though God already knows our words before we think them. And you can see that in Psalm 139:4. We see many instances in the Old Testament of God waiting for the people to cry out before he acts, which teaches us that God is one in whom we can confide and be close to. And then Psalm 14 begins with this familiar phrase, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. But this could also apply as easily to the one who hates God as it does to the one who believes no God exists. It's followed by, because there is no, it could be taken as an expression of the time as he is irrelevant. Not necessarily expression that God doesn't exist, but God is someone they defy or despise. And it's followed by statements also seen elsewhere in the Psalms that some take out of context to mean everyone who ever lived is a vile sinner deserving of eternal torment. But this is a lament over unrestrained evil, a cry for kindness and compassion, not a dissertation on eternal salvation. Consider the prophet Elijah in 1 Kings 19:10, who whined to God that he was the only prophet left in Israel, and God told him in verse 18 that he had 7,000 reserved. Elijah was in the depths of despair then, and so was David here, and that's why they say the things they say. Now, Psalm 15 is another list of contrasts between the godly and the wicked, and you can read through that. And then in 16, David shows how he has lived a righteous life, though of course not a perfect one. And verses 6 through 11 of that psalm were quoted by Peter on Pentecost as a messianic prophecy, but of course it also applied to David in that he would be spared from his present struggle. And Paul also quoted verse 10 in Acts 13:35 as a prophecy of Jesus' resurrection. And this is where I wanted to show you this image about prophecy. This is the nature of biblical prophecy. It's like a spiral or a spring. If you look at the spring on end, it looks like a circle, but if you can see it by the side, the circle moves as it revolves. So though there is an immediate fulfillment in any one rotation, there may be many others as time goes on, but we don't know how many times a prophecy will be fulfilled until we reach the end. So we have all these instances on the picture here of, sorry about that popping up, each time there's a rotation comes back around again. And this is the nature of, this is why I say that people who have said in history that this is it, these are the end times, weren't necessarily wrong. They were recognizing signs as we all should be looking for, but they didn't know where they were on the vertical scale here. They didn't know how many more times this would come around. So a prophecy, and any given prophecy, not all of them together, but any prophecy at all, can be represented by this spring and each rotation as a fulfillment of that prophecy. So that's what I wanted to make the point about here, even though this isn't a primarily prophetic text in the Psalms, but it gives the illustration that biblical prophecy can keep coming back. Okay, so we don't know the end until we get there, but we shouldn't be so hard on people who misread something or who, as far as prophetic signs go, or, you know, neglect prophecy completely. The point is that if people are looking, that's commendable, but they have to be careful not to jump to the conclusion that this is the final fulfillment of something. And some things have been fulfilled. A lot has been fulfilled, but a lot remains as well. Now let's go to Psalm 17, and this is another lament for God to act quickly on David's behalf. Just as the wicked had David in the center of their vision, so also David pleads for God to do the same, to keep him in the center of his vision. And at the end, David expresses his confidence that he will one day see the face of God. And again, we can't necessarily say that this is always referring to the end times or the afterlife. He may be thinking about the temple, as some commentators believe. And then Psalm 18 was, per the title there in the psalm itself, written after God had subdued all David's enemies and he was resting. And so it's a hymn of gratitude and relief. There's no peace without gratitude and no gratitude without humility. And just as God treats the merciful with mercy, so also he treats the treacherous with treachery. Many who fault God for this are all too willing to practice this themselves. They think that God shouldn't mistreat people even when they deserve it and even when they've mistreated others. But God, his opinion matters a lot more on this. This is the source of our morality. So it isn't wrong for God to do this, to treat people as they have treated others. And then Psalm 19, this 18 was fairly long, so we scrolled to that, begins with familiar phrases to God as the Creator. As also Paul wrote in the first chapter of Romans, people are without excuse for acknowledging that this realm was designed by an intelligent and powerful being. And the identity of this Creator is made clear in fulfilled prophecy, and especially Jesus rising from the dead. The one true God created the heavenly bodies other people worshipped as gods. So the rest of the psalm then compares the instruction of God to the glory of creation, which in comparison to both should make us humble and respectful. And then Psalm 20 is basically a pep talk before battle and an intercessory prayer. And Psalm 21 expresses gratitude for the deliverance that God brought as a result. And Psalm 22 then returns to the lament of the times when God seems far away. This is one that Jesus quoted on the cross, so we can't think that he was actually saying God had actually forsaken him on the cross, but that it's an expression of deep pain and loneliness. The details here are clear evidence of divine prophecy, since David could not possibly know as a mere human that this would be literally and physically fulfilled in the Messiah. Even so, the psalm ends in confident hope of victory, restoration, and rest. So when Jesus quoted this psalm, he's not necessarily saying that God absolutely forsook him, but that's what he was going through at the time in his deep despair. Anyway, this is the psalm where he took that from. And then Psalm 23, of course, is one of the most familiar and memorized passages of Scripture. It teaches us to rest confidently in God, whether good times are bad, and that we are assured that he will keep us close to himself. The sheep are safe, but only if they follow the trustworthy shepherd. Then Psalm 24 begins with a phrase used in 1 Corinthians 10:26 to teach that Christians are not bound by dietary laws. God, as the supreme sovereign of the whole world, can change rules for people without his own nature changing. But the message of the psalm overall is that only the righteous can approach God, and as Christians, our righteousness comes only from belonging to Jesus. It's not our own righteousness, not in this age of grace and faith. So we are not bound by dietary laws, but that's a New Testament issue. And as noted in the commentary in the description, Psalm 22 is about the cross, Psalm 23 is about the shepherd, and Psalm 24 is about the crown. So there are other reasons for the order of the Psalms. It's not just arbitrary. Now, Psalm 25 is a plea for God to guide us and to forget our shortcomings and to remember his promises in the honor of his name, which would be marred if he didn't keep them. Of course, he will, but Some wonder why we should pray, since per Matthew 6:8, God already knows what we'll say. But not only is it for our own benefit, since it reminds us of our humble position, it also seems from Scripture that sometimes God waits for us to ask before he acts. And then 26 is another plea for vindication for justice against false charges, while 27 goes from confident trust to despair and lament, and then back to confident trust and encouragement. And then 28 is a cry for immediate rescue from dire circumstances, as well as an imprecatory prayer, which is a prayer for vengeance and destruction against evildoers. It's not prayer for us to do something, but for God to do something. We need to remember that the love of God is not in conflict with the holiness of God, because both good and evil must be paid their wages. So if God pays back evil with destruction and evil, and not that he's committing evil as a sin, but evil in the biblical term of calamity, this is perfectly in line with the God of love, who cares about justice and holiness as well. He isn't just one or just the other. And then Psalm 29 teaches us that though the heathen believed storms and other natural events were caused by local gods, the real God was in command of all the forces of nature. Then we'll go down to Psalm 30, which is a praise song for the dedication of the temple, along with relief that God had rescued David once again. Now, the temple had not been built, so it probably refers to the tabernacle, though it could also have been intended for the time when the permanent temple would be finished. Verse 5 is familiar to most Christians, that though we may experience either persecution from enemies or discipline from God, it won't last forever, but God's love and concern will. And then Psalm 31 is yet another plea for vindication, and it includes expressions of revulsion for those who worship false gods. David's teachings, such as not to be quick to think God has abandoned us, come from his own experiences, good or bad, and not from dry philosophy or imagination. So David is learning his lessons from his experiences and then passing them on. Those are the best times to teach, when you have an actual experience in something. And then Psalm 32 expresses David's relief that forgiveness came, but only after he admitted his sin. To forgive, as I said before, unrepentant sin is to encourage more sin and deny justice to the victim, which in this case was God. So we have to love the victim more than the perpetrator, especially when the victim, the one having been wronged, is God. Now, Psalm 33 is filled with praise, especially for God's creative power. The use of instruments in music was clearly encouraged, as opposed to the belief of some that worship should only ever be with our voices. As for the familiar phrase, and we'll see that again in Psalm 150, about loud clanging cymbals, so it isn't always solemn hymns, somber laments either. But as for the familiar phrase in verse 12, let me scroll down to that. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. It likely only refers to Israel in this context, as only Israel had a covenant relationship with God, and the church is not a nation. A similar phrase is found in 2 Chronicles 7:14, and again, it's in the context of people, the people in the land of Israel. Psalm 34 is another praise song for God's deliverance, but can we take verse 10 as a guarantee that godly people will never suffer in this life? Even David lamented at other times that this is not the case at all. So this reminds us that this is poetry, not systematic theology. And of course, verse 20 is clearly another messianic prophecy, which is quoted in John 19:36 about seeing, see, what verse did I say here? I got verse 20, sorry. Protects all his bones, not one of them is broken. That's obviously a prophetic statement there. And then Psalm 35 is another plea for help and vindication, as well as for paying back the wicked who had repaid David's compassion with violence and treachery. So he's asking for revenge, especially against these people who he had been kind to, who paid him back with nothing but wickedness and unkindness. And then Psalm 36 is another appeal to wisdom primarily. These are all the ways in which a person would live a wise life. Psalm 37 continues that, but emphasizes the fact that we need to keep faith in God when everything seems lost. Psalm 38, and that's fairly long, but again, you should be, Psalms are meant to be read for each person. But Psalm 38 revisits the theme of repentance and appeals to mercy after sin. And Psalm 39 as the determination to keep from returning to sin. So it's only wise to make plans not to sin in the future, to try to do what we can to prevent that. And then Psalm 40 is another look back at how God had always delivered David through all of his trials as a testimony for others. So we can use even our bad experiences as a testimony. And then Psalm 41, the last one in this book or section, is a practical lesson in kindness, which matches up with some of the Beatitudes, if you read those in the Gospels. But then David cries out to God against those who keep wishing for his demise. And verse 9 is clearly prophetic of Jesus' betrayal by Judas, as cited by Jesus himself in John 13:18. And a lot of Bibles today will have also cross references to tell you where exactly each of these quotations are in the Old Testament. And that's pretty much the end of Book 1, so we'll continue with Psalm 42, Book 2, in the next lesson.